I was 10 years old the winter my father went up the Black Spar after a woman nobody else in Steeple Rock would so much as look at. And if you want to know the truth of how I came to have a mother, that is where it starts 60 feet over the quill, in a snow so thick you could not see the far rail. I have told this story maybe 4 times in my life, and never well, because the men who knew my father would have called him hard and they would not have been wrong. And a hard man pulling a stranger back from the edge of the world does not make sense to people who only ever saw the hard part. But I saw both parts. I was sitting up on the timber sled with my hands jammed in my armpits, watching, the day it happened, and I am the only one left who did. We had gone up the high line for cedar. My father, Silas Reese, hauled timber off the ridge in the cold months when the ranch could spare him, because cash money in our country came hard, and a widower with 2 children, and a mortgage took it where he could. The Black Spar was the railroad trestle that crossed the Quill River Gorge above our valley, a long black skeleton of a thing, and the timber road ran alongside it where the grade was easy. We were not supposed to be near the rails. My father said so every trip and meant it. The snow had started about noon, and by 2 o'clock it had teeth. I remember my father pulling the team up sudden, the way he did when something was wrong with a fence or an animal, that stillness coming over him. I followed his eyes out along the trestle. There was a person standing on it. Not walking it, folks cross the spar on foot sometimes, fool's habit, to save the long way around. This one was standing dead still, out past the middle, where the gorge dropped away under the ties into nothing but white air and the sound of the river far down. A woman. I could tell by the skirt the wind was tearing at. She had no coat that I could see, just a dress and a shawl, and she was standing with one hand on the rail and looking down into the gorge the way you look at a thing you have already made up your mind about. My father said one word. He said, "Stay," to me, the same word he gave the dog, and then he was off the sled and walking. He did not run. I want you to understand that because it is the first true thing I learned about saving a person, though I did not know I was learning it. He did not run, and he did not shout. A man who runs at someone on a high place is a man who pushes them off it. My father walked out onto that trestle slow, putting each boot careful on the icy ties, with the gorge breathing cold underneath him. And when he was still a good way off he stopped and he said, loud enough to carry over the wind but not so loud it was a shout, "That's a long way down, and it's a bad cold day to be looking at it." She turned her head. I could not see her face from the sled, only that she turned, and that she did not let go of the rail, and that her not letting go was the whole world for a moment. "Don't come closer," she said. "The wind took most of it, but I heard the shape of it." "I won't," my father said. And he didn't. He hunkered down right there on the ties in the snow like a man with all the time in creation, like the two of them had only stopped to talk fence lines. "I'll just sit here. My boy's back on the sled and he's cold and the team don't like the wind, so I can't go far, but I can sit here a spell." I have thought about that my whole life. He put me into it. He told a desperate stranger about his cold boy and his nervous horses, gave her ordinary things to stand in for the unbearable one, made the trestle into a place where 2 grown people were simply caught out in weather. I did not understand it then. I understood it later, when I was a father myself, and learned that the way you reach a drowning person is not to lunge, but to give them your hand and let them be the one to take it. They stayed like that a while. The snow came between us so that I lost them and found them and lost them again. I was so cold I had started to shake, but I would not have moved off that sled for anything, because I could feel, the way a child feels weather coming, that something was being decided out there on the black iron. I could not hear most of what he said to her. Some of it came back in pieces years later when she told me herself, and I will tell you that part when I come to it. What I saw was this. After a long time, my father stood up slow and put out his hand not toward her, but to the side, toward the timber road, toward home, an offer and not a grab, and after another long while, the woman let go of the rail. She came to him along the ties unsteady, her hands out for balance, and he did not snatch at her even then. He waited until she was close, and then he took off his own coat, his good wool coat that he had owned since before my mother died, and he put it around her shoulders, and the two of them came in off the black spar together with the snow swallowing the gorge behind them. That is how Della Mercer came down off the bridge. I did not know her name yet. I did not know anything except that my father had brought a half-frozen stranger out of the storm and was lifting her up onto the timber sled beside me like she weighed nothing, and that her face, when I finally saw it close, was not what I expected. I had imagined, in the way children do, some wild creature. She was only a woman, maybe 25, with a plain, pretty face gone gray with cold, and eyes that had cried themselves past crying, and she looked at me, a strange boy under a buffalo robe, and she tried to smile at me so that I would not be afraid. I have never forgotten that. Standing at the edge of her own grave, the first thing she had left in her was a smile for a cold child. "This is Caleb," my father said, climbing up and taking the lines. "Caleb, get the robe over the lady. We're going home ahead of this weather and there'll be no more talk of anything else." That was all he said about it. No more talk of anything else. He laid that down like a fence post, and in our family a thing my father said in that voice was simply how the world was going to be from then on. The Wintering, that was the name on our place. The Reese Ranch, given by my grandfather who said the high country was a fine place to summer cattle and a hard place to winter them, and the name had stuck to the homestead like burrs to wool. It sat in a fold of the Hardscrabble Range where two creeks came together, a low log house my grandfather built and my father had added rooms to, a good barn, a bunkhouse we did not use anymore because we could not pay a hand the year round, and beyond it the white-humped country running up to the timber. We came down the timber road into the teeth of the storm, and the last mile was near blind. My father knew it by his hands. When we finally banged into the yard, the kitchen window was a square of yellow light through the snow, and standing in it, with her face pressed to the cold glass, was my sister. Pearl was 5 that winter. She was the baby, the last thing our mother gave us before the fever took her 2 years gone, and she had our mother's same fair hair, and a way of looking at people straight on, with her whole heart in her eyes, that the rest of us had learned to hide and she had not learned yet. She had been left in the care of old Tobias. I will come to him. And she had been watching at that window for her father the way she watched every storm, because she had got it into her small head, after our mother, that people who went out into bad weather might not come back, and no amount of telling could shake it out of her. So the first thing my sister saw when the sled came out of the snow was her father alive, and then a strange woman wrapped in her father's coat. I have heard people say children are cruel. They are, sometimes, the way a hard winter is, without meaning to be. But they are also the only ones among us who have not yet learned to look away from a person who is suffering, and that night my sister taught the whole-grown world a lesson it had refused, because the whole-grown world of Steeple Rock had walked past Della Mercer that very week and left her standing on a bridge. We got Della into the house. She could barely walk by then, the cold had got down into her and she was past shivering, which my father knew was the dangerous part. He carried her the last steps and set her in the chair by the stove, my mother's chair, the one none of us sat in, and he did it without a flicker, like it was just the nearest chair, and maybe to him it was. He started giving orders the way he did in a calving storm. Caleb, more wood. Tobias, the kettle. He pulled off Della's ruined shoes himself, which were town shoes, thin things never meant for our country, and when he saw her feet he went still for half a second and then kept on, brisk. And I knew it was bad, and I knew he did not want her to see him know it. And my sister Pearl, who had been told to stay back out of the way, did not stay back. She walked right up to the stranger in our mother's chair. She stood in front of Della Mercer and she looked at her with that wholehearted straight-on look, and Della looked back at her, too worn to do anything else, and my sister reached up with one small hand and laid it on the woman's cold cheek the way you would gentle a sick calf, and she said, I will get to exactly what she said. It is the hinge the whole story turns on, and I have spent my life trying to deserve it, and I am not going to spend it cheap here in the middle of a snowstorm. Let it stand that my sister touched her face. Let it stand that a ruined woman who had decided the world had no place for her felt a child's hand on her cheek, and that something in her that had given up came partway back, just from that. My father saw it. He was kneeling there with her thin wet shoe still in his hand, and he saw his motherless girl reach up to a stranger, and I watched something cross his face that I had not seen since we buried my mother. It was gone quick. He stood up. He said, "Gruff, Pearl, let the lady be, she's tired," and he turned away to the stove. But I had seen it. The hard part of my father had a crack in it that night, and a 5-year-old's hand had found it. I should tell you who we were before Della, so you understand what she walked into, because a home is not just walls, and it was not just a roof we were offering her. My father had not always been hard. I have to take that on faith and on the few things Tobias told me, because the soft father belonged to before I was old enough to keep him. The story, as I pieced it, was this. My mother, Cora, came up to the hardscrabble as a bride, and the two of them were happy in the plain, enormous way of people who do not know to be grateful for it yet. They had me. They had a stretch of good years. And then Pearl came, and the fever came that same fall, and it went through the high valleys like a scythe. And it took my mother in 4 days, and it took the strong young schoolteacher down in Steeple Rock, and it took 2 of the oldest children. And when it was done, my father had a newborn, a boy of 8, a ranch he could not leave, and a wife in the ground up on the knoll where the aspens were. He did not break. That was the trouble almost. A man who breaks you can sometimes put back together. My father did the other thing, the thing hard men do, which is he closed. He got up the morning after the burying and he did the chores, and he did them the next morning, and he kept doing them, and somewhere in all that doing he nailed the door shut on the part of himself that could be hurt again, because he had a baby girl to feed and could not afford to be a man with his chest torn open. He hired old Tobias Flint that winter, a stove-up cowhand too crippled in the hip to ride hard any more but sound as oak in every way that mattered, and Tobias more or less raised Pearl and half-raised me while my father raised cattle, and the 3 men and the baby of us made a household that worked and did not laugh much. We were not unhappy, exactly. We were like the country in February, alive under the snow, but you would have had to dig to prove it. The women of Steeple Rock had tried, the first year. They had come up with covered dishes and meaning looks, the way good women do, and 1 or 2 of them had a widowed sister or a marriageable cousin, and my father had been so plainly stone about all of it that they had stopped coming. By that winter the town had settled on a story about Silas Reese, that he was a cold man, that he did not want a wife, that he kept those poor children up on that lonesome place out of pride. None of it was true the way they meant it, but it was the easy story, and easy stories are the ones a town keeps. So when Della Mercer came west that fall, half the town knew the bones of her trouble within a day of the stage rolling in, the way they always did, and not one of them connected the lonesome widower up the hardscrabble with the stranded woman at the hotel. Why would they? They had a story about each, and the stories did not touch. Here is what had happened to her. I had it from her own mouth later, on a spring porch when the worst was over, and I will give it to you plain. Della had been a schoolteacher back in Ohio, an orphan raised by an aunt, a woman with no money and no people and nothing in the world but a good mind and a steady character, which, in the place and the time she came from, was worth exactly nothing to a woman who wished to make her own way. The aunt had died. The school had given Della's place to a married man with a family to keep, which was the custom. And Della, looking down the barrel of a long gray life as somebody's unpaid spinster relation, had answered an advertisement. It was a matrimonial agency, the kind that promised respectable women respectable Western matches and respectable Western men respectable Eastern wives, and took a fee from both ends. The man who ran the local end of it, who had corresponded with her and arranged her passage and held her funds in trust against her arrival. For it was not safe, he wrote, for a lady to carry such a sum across the country, was named Royal Teague. You will hear more of Royal Teague. He is the snake in this story, and I have hated few men in a long life as I have hated him, and I am old enough now to be ashamed of how much I have enjoyed hating him. He had arranged a match for Della with a rancher in our county, a widower of property named. It does not matter what he was named, because by the time Della's stage reached Steeple Rock the man was 3 weeks dead of a burst appendix and in the ground, and the property had gone to a nephew back east who wanted no part of any maylord or bride, and the whole arrangement Della had crossed a continent for was so much smoke. She could have weathered even that. She was strong, I have told you. What she could not weather was that when she went to Royal Teague for the money he had held in trust, her own money, every dollar she had in the world, Teague was gone. He had closed his little office and ridden out of the county the same week her intended died, with her funds and the funds of God knows how many other hopeful women in his saddlebags, and he had left her with a hotel bill she could not pay, in a town where she knew not one living soul, 2,000 miles from the grave of the only person who had ever loved her. The hotel had put her things in the street when the bill came due. The respectable women of Steeple Rock, who had heard she was some kind of maylord or woman whose arrangement had fallen through, which to their ears was a shabby thing, a thing that clung, had given her the kind of charity that is mostly a closed door with a coin pushed under it. The men had looked at her in the other way. And Della Mercer, schoolteacher, orphan, a good woman who had done nothing in her life but tried to make an honest place for herself in a world with no honest place to spare, had walked out the timber road in the first hard snow because she could not think where else a person in her position was meant to go, and had climbed up onto the black spar to look at the only door she had left. The blizzard kept us shut in 3 days, and I have come to believe those 3 days were the making of everything. A Snowdon ranch is a small world. There is no riding to town, no neighbor dropping by, no work but the close work, the stock to feed, the wood to keep, the meals to make, and it throws people up against each other so there is nowhere to hide what they are. A man can be a stranger to his own children across 100 suppers when there is somewhere to go between them. Shut 4 people and a fever-sick woman in a log house with the snow to the windowsills, and the truth of them comes out fast. The first night, Della took a fever, which my father had expected from her feet, and the cold gone into her chest. She did not know much of that night, and neither, mercifully, did I, being sent to my pallet. But I know my father sat up with her, because I woke once toward morning for water and saw him in the lamplight by my mother's chair, where they had made her a bed, and he was not asleep. He was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at the stranger the way a man looks at a problem he cannot solve by working harder, which was the only way my father knew to look at anything, and not solving it, and staying anyway. She came clear of the fever on the 2nd day. I remember because I was the one in the room when she woke. Tobias had set me to mind her while he and my father dug out to the barn, and she opened her eyes and looked at the log rafters, and you could see her remembering, piece by piece, where she was and why. And the remembering was terrible to watch. I was 10. I did not know what to do with a grown woman's grief, so I did the only thing I could think of, which was to hold out the cup of broth Tobias had left and say, "You're at the wintering. That's our place. Pa says you're to stay till you're mended and there's no more talk of anything else." She looked at me a long moment. Then she said in a cracked voice, "Is that what your pa says?" "Yes'm, when he says a thing like that it's just how it is." And Della Mercer laughed. It was a small, broken glass sort of laugh, half a sob, but it was a laugh, and I have since thought it might have been the first one in a long while, and that a strange child telling her solemnly that there would be no more talk of anything else was as good a rope as anybody had thrown her. "All right," she said. "Then I suppose I'll stay till I'm mended." She did not say what we both heard under it, which was, "And then what?" There was no answer to, "And then what?" and we were neither of us going to spoil the broth by reaching for one. Pearl, of course, did not care anything for "and then what." Pearl simply decided. By the 2nd afternoon, my sister had appointed herself nurse, doctor, and constant companion to the woman in the corner. She brought Della her rag doll to hold. She brought her a smooth river stone she prized. She sat on the floor by the chair and told Della long unspooling stories about the barn cats and which hen was meanest, and how our mother was up on the knoll with the aspens, and was an angel now and watched us. All of it delivered in that grave, wholehearted way, and Della, who I think had braced herself to be tolerated in our house, to be a burden gotten through, found herself instead being courted by a 5-year-old, and it undid her more than any unkindness could have. I caught her crying over it once. Pearl had gone to fetch some new treasure, and Della was sitting with the rag doll in her lap, and tears were running down without a sound, and when she saw me she wiped them and said, "She's a dear little thing." And then lower, not really to me, "She oughtn't get attached. It's not kind to let her." I did not understand that then. I understand it now. Della knew she could not stay, knew it as a hard fact of arithmetic. An unmarried woman cannot simply live in a widower's house. The town would eat them both, and there was no money and no claim and no place for her. And she was trying, even half dead and penniless, to protect my sister from a leaving that had not even been arranged yet. That was the kind of woman she was. The world had given her every reason to grab whatever shelter she could, and let the child's heart fall where it might. And instead she was lying there worrying about Pearl's small feelings ahead of her own enormous ones. It was Tobias who said the thing out loud. Old Tobias Flint, who had buried 2 wives of his own in a long life and was past being afraid of plain talk. He was at the stove, and Della had said her piece about not letting Pearl get attached, and Tobias did not turn around. He just said, stirring, "Little late for that, ma'am." And it was. We were all of us a little late for that 3 days in. My father was the hard case. He was always going to be the hard case. Where Pearl rushed in and I hovered and Tobias spoke plain, my father went the other way. He got busier and quieter, which was his whole grief language, the only tongue he had left. He was up before light and out past dark. He found work in that Snowdon house that did not need doing. He mended tack that was not broken. And he spoke to Della only when he had to, in short, courteous sentences. "You're looking stronger. Eat what you can. The girl's not bothering you." And then he would find a reason to be elsewhere. A person who did not know him would have called it coldness, and the town, when it heard the bones of it later, did call it coldness. It was the opposite. I knew my father. The man did not flee a thing because he felt nothing. He fled it because he felt too much and had sworn off feeling, 2 years back at a graveside. And here in his own front room was a woman who had reached for the same door his own grief sometimes whispered about. And his motherless daughter was climbing into her lap. And the danger of it, the sheer danger to a man who had nailed himself shut, must have been roaring in him like the storm in the chimney. He gave it away once. The 3rd night, the snow finally easing, I came out of my pallet room and the 2 of them were at the table, late, Della able to sit up by then. They did not see me in the dark of the doorway. They were not doing anything. There was a Bible between them, my mother's, and Della had been reading to Pearl from it earlier and had left it out. And my father had it open to the front where the family was written in, the births, the marriage, and the one death, in my mother's own hand, and then, at the last, in his. She had a fine hand, Della said quiet. Better than mine at most things, my father said. That was all. But it was more than my father had said about my mother to a living soul in 2 years, and he had said it to Della Mercer, and I crept back to my pallet with my heart going strange, because even at 10 I knew I had heard a door that had been nailed shut give one small creak on its hinge. The snow broke on the 4th day, hard blue sky and a cold that cracked the trees, and with the breaking of the snow the world came back, and the world meant the town, and the town meant trouble of the ordinary human kind. The first to reach us was the Reverend Amos Pike, who drove his cutter up the timber road the moment it was passable, and I have to be fair to him because he was not a bad man, only a frightened one, frightened of what people would say. which is its own kind of badness when it sits in a man whose trade is supposed to be courage. He had heard, the whole town had heard by then, that Silas Reese had taken the stranded Maylorder woman up to his place in the storm, and he had come, he said, out of concern. He sat in our kitchen and drank our coffee and got to his concern sideways, the way such men do. It was a delicate situation. A man alone, a woman of he would not say of what, but the word hung there unsaid, a woman whose arrangement had been, irregular. People talked. For the children's sake, surely, Silas would see how it looked. There were arrangements that could be made. The county home, down at the territorial seat, took in women in Miss Mercer's circumstances. It would be the proper course. The Christian course, he said, and I watched my father's jaw at that, because if there was one thing Silas Reese knew cold, it was the difference between the Christian course and the comfortable one, having had the town offer him the comfortable one dressed as the Christian one for 2 years running. My father heard him all the way out. That was his way. He let a man finish, gave him all the rope. Then he said, "She climbed up on the black spar, Reverend, because this town that's so worried how it looks left her not one door to knock on. I'll thank it to worry less how it looks and more how it acts." He set down his cup. "She'll stay till she's strong, and after that she'll do as she chooses, because she's a grown woman and it's hers to choose. You can tell them that down below. And you can tell them I said the Lord I was raised on went and ate supper with exactly the kind of folks this town's been crossing the street to avoid." The Reverend went home. He did not come back. And the story that went down the mountain in his cutter was the one my father had handed him, and it did not soften the town, it hardened it. Because a town will forgive you almost anything except being told it has behaved badly by a man it had already decided was too proud. So the line got drawn that day, clear. There was the wintering and there was Steeple Rock and a stretch of cold air between. Now I have to tell you how Della earned her place, because it matters that she earned it and was not simply kept, and because it was in the earning that the thing between her and my father grew, slow as ice going to water, where neither of them was looking. She would not be a burden. The minute she could stand without the wall, she was at work, and there was no stopping her, and Tobias and I learned quick not to try. She had never run a ranch kitchen in her life. She was a town-raised schoolteacher who had boarded all her days, but she had a teacher's way of watching a thing done once and then doing it, and she had pride, the good kind, the kind that will not eat bread it has not paid for. Inside a week she had taken the cooking off Tobias, who was glad to give it. Inside, too, she had our wrecked house in order, and it was wrecked, in the way a house of 3 men and a baby goes wrecked, not dirty so much as forgotten. No one having cared in 2 years whether a curtain hung straight or a thing got mended before it tore through. She cared, and the caring changed the house in a way none of us had words for. The first night there were flowers on the table, dried ones, there being no others in January. A fistful of last fall's everlasting she had found in a fence corner, and Pearl had carried in proud as a bride's bouquet. And we 4, 2 hard men and a boy and a baby who had eaten 2 years of suppers like men forking down fuel, sat and ate at a set table with a center to it, and nobody said a word about it, and it was one of the loudest things that ever happened in that house. She took me on, too. She found out inside a day that I could barely read. There had been no school worth the name since the teacher died of the same fever that took my mother, and my father had no letters to spare me and no time to teach. And she was scandalized in a quiet teacher's way, and she said about it. Evenings, by the lamp, she taught me my letters off that same family Bible, and off a primer she had carried 2,000 miles and would not part with even when she had nothing else. I owe her every word I have ever read, including the ones I am setting down now. An old man writing his family story by his own hand, 80 years on, that is Della Mercer's doing, reaching out of that winter to put the pen in my fingers. And she taught Pearl her letters too, the 2 of them with their fair heads bent together at the lamp, and that picture, the schoolteacher who had crossed a continent for a home that died before she reached it, teaching a motherless girl her ABCs at our scarred table. That is the picture I would set in the window of this whole story if I could, the one that says everything the rest of it only circles. My father watched it from the dark end of the room. He never sat in the lamp's circle, but he never left the room either those evenings. He would have his mending or his accounts at the far table in the shadow, and he would not look up, and I came to understand he was not working at all half the time. He was listening to his daughter learn her letters from a woman's voice. He had not heard a woman's voice in that house in 2 years. I think he sat in the dark to drink it where no one could see him do it. It was about 3 weeks in that Pearl said the thing. I have made you wait for it, and I will not make you wait longer, because it was not a grand moment when it came. It never is. The real ones, it was a Tuesday, and it was bath night, which in our country in winter meant the tin tub by the stove and a great heating of water. And Della had taken over bath night the way she had taken over everything, gentle and total. She had Pearl in the tub and was washing her hair, and Pearl was doing her endless talk, and I was at the table with my letters, and my father was in from the barn early, in his chair by the door pulling off his boots, near enough to hear. And Pearl, in the middle of some long account of nothing, tipped her wet head back against Della's hand the way a child does when it is wholly safe, wholly trusting. And she said, not asking anyone, just saying it, the way she said the hens were mean, and our mother was an angel, just another true thing in her catalog of true things. When you're our mama, can I have the bed by the window? The room stopped. Della's hands went still in my sister's hair. I saw her face, and it had gone white and then red, and she opened her mouth and shut it, because what was there to say, and into that silence, before Della could find a word to gently take it away, my sister, hearing the silence and not understanding it, turned around in the tub with the water running off her and looked up at Della with her whole heart in her eyes, the straight-on look, our mother's look. And she said it again, plainer, the way you repeat a thing to a person who maybe did not hear. Be our mama, will you? And then, and this is the part I have carried 60 years, this is the hinge, my sister, not knowing she was deciding the rest of all our lives, turned that look on our father in his chair by the door, and she said, Pa, tell her be our mama. Nobody breathed. I did not. The fire spat. And Della Mercer, kneeling there by the tub with her hands full of my sister's wet hair and her own ruin and her own dignity and her own impossible arithmetic all at war in her face, looked up past Pearl, across the room, into the dark by the door where my father sat with one boot in his hand, and she did not say anything, because it was not hers to say. She had handed it with her eyes to him. My father set his boot down on the floor, careful, like it might wake something. He did not answer Pearl. He looked at Della, and Della looked at him, the two of them across the lamplight and the steam, and the thing that passed between them I was too young to name but not too young to feel. It was the feeling of two people who have each separately decided a door is shut for good, discovering at the same instant that the other one has a hand on the latch. Then my father did the wisest and the hardest thing, which was to refuse to let a 5-year-old in a bathtub decide it for them. He got up. He came across the room slow, and he crouched down by the tub so his face was level with Pearl's, and he said, gentle as I ever heard him, Pearl, you can't tell a person to be your mama. That's not a thing that gets told. He smoothed her wet hair back. That's a thing a person chooses free when they're ready, and you let them be. And then this is the part. He stood, and he looked at Della, and he said, not to Pearl now, to her, plain and level, and with 2 years of nailed-shut door creaking open behind it. But it's worth choosing, I'll say that much. This is a good place to be wanted, Miss Mercer, and these are good children to be wanted by, and you'd not be. He stopped and started over because my father did not have the smooth words and would not fake them. You'd not be taken in out of pity. You'd be wanted. That's all I'll say on it tonight. Then he took his coat off the peg and went back out to the barn. There was no real reason to go to, because he had said more in those 10 seconds than he had said in 2 years. And a man like that has to go stand in the cold afterward and let his heart slow down. And Della knelt there with Pearl, and I watched her press her lips together hard and look down into the bathwater, and a tear fell off her chin and made a ring in it. And Pearl, Satisfied somehow, having gotten an answer she liked the shape of even if she did not follow the words, went back to talking about the hens. Nothing was decided that night, but everything had turned. You could feel it in the house, the way you can feel the year turn in February though the snow is deep as ever. Something underneath had started running the other way. What followed was the strangest courtship the hardscrabble ever saw, because it was conducted almost entirely without words, between two people who had each sworn off the whole business, with a boy and an old man, and a 5-year-old as the unknowing chaperones, in the dead of a high-country winter. It went like this. My father started coming in for the noon meal. That does not sound like courtship. You did not know my father. In 2 years he had not once come down off the range at noon. He ate cold biscuit in his saddle and stayed out till dark because the work was a place to hide. Now of a sudden the work could spare him at noon. He would come in stamping snow, gruff, and there would be a hot meal, and Della would set it before him, and they would say 4 or 5 sentences to each other about the stock and the weather, and he would eat and go back out. That was all. But he came every day, and a man does not change the shape of his whole grieving life to eat a noon meal. Unless the noon meal has become the thing, the day is built around. And Della started saving things to tell him. Small things that the brindle cow seemed off her feed, that a window in the loft had cracked in the cold, that Pearl had said something funny, nothings, the ordinary freight of a shared life, and she hoarded them through the morning to hand to him at noon, and I watched her do it, and I do not think she knew she was doing it. That is how you tell, by the way, not the big declarations. The small things saved up. A person who is saving up the small things to tell you has already decided something, whether they have told themselves or not. Tobias saw it before either of them. Tobias saw everything from the corner of the stove. He said to me once, "Lo, while we forked hay, your pa's thawin', boy." And then, because Tobias was a fair man, took the right kind of fire to do it. That one don't push. She just sets there warm and waits for the ice to figure it out on its own. Smartest courtin' I ever watched, and neither one of 'em knows they're at it. I asked him, I was 10, I asked blunt things. Are they gonna get married? Tobias chewed on that and on his tobacco. If the world leaves 'em be long enough to, he said. But the world don't generally leave folks be. Something always rides up the road. And he looked down the timber road when he said it, the way old men do, like he could see the something coming, and the awful thing is he was right, and it was already coming, though we had a few more good weeks before it got to us. I want to give you those weeks, because they were the happiest of my childhood, and because the family that Royal Teague rode back to break was a real family by then, made out of nothing but a winter and some kindness, and you have to see it whole to feel what was at stake. There was the night the Chinook came, and we all went out in the sudden warm dark, and Della had never felt a Chinook, and stood in it laughing with the snow melting off the eaves like rain. There was the morning my father, without a word about it, moved my mother's chair, the one none of us sat in, the one they had made Della's sickbed, over to the table and set it as Della's place, which in our family's silent language was a thing close to a vow. There was the evening Della finished teaching me to read a whole page clean, and my father, in the dark at the far table, said, "Good, Caleb," in a voice that had something wet at the back of it, the first praise of that kind I remember from him. There was Pearl, growing round and bright and sure, a different child than the wary watcher at the window, because a child with a mother's hands on her is a different creature than a child without, and we had all forgotten, until we watched it come back, how much. We were a family. We had not said the words, and there had been no preacher and no ring, and we were a family anyway, the way a thing can be true before it is official, the way the spring is real under the snow. And then in the first soft week of March, with the road gone to mud, a man rode up it that I did not know, and Tobias did, and I watched the old man's face close like a fist. He came up easy, that first time, like a neighbor. He was a well-made man, Royal Teague. I will give the devil that, handsome in the smooth way that town women trusted and range men did not. Good coat, good horse, a smile already working before he was off the saddle. He sat his horse in our yard and looked our place over the way a man prices a thing, and he called out friendly that he was looking for the Reese place and had he found it. My father came out of the barn wiping his hands. Della was in the house and did not see, yet. I was at the woodpile and saw it all. "You found it," my father said. He did not say it friendly. My father could read a man across a yard, and I think he had Teague's number before the man's boots hit the mud, just from the way he priced the ranch with his eyes. Teague swung down and put out his hand and gave his name, and gave it proud, like it was a card that opened doors, Royal Teague, and named his trade, which he now called land agent, and said he'd heard there was a Mercer woman come to grief in the county, a woman he had a prior business interest in, a matter of accounts to settle, and he understood she might be found up here, and he'd be obliged. My father did not take the hand. He let it hang there in the air between them till Teague drew it back. "What's your business with her?" my father said, flat. And here Teague made his mistake, because he did not yet know what he had ridden into. He thought he had ridden up to a lonesome rancher who'd taken in a charity case, and he played it that way, smooth and confidential, man to man. He said it was a delicate thing. The woman had had funds, he said, placed with his agency in trust. There had been irregularities. The match had fallen through, sad business, and in the confusion the accounting had gotten, tangled, and there were monies owed in both directions. And frankly, between men, the woman was not entirely. He tapped his temple, smiling, not entirely to be relied on in her account of things, given the strain she'd been under, given that she had, he'd heard, done something rash up on the railroad bridge. A woman like that. You understood. He'd come to settle it quiet and take the difficulty off Silas's hands. I have hated, as I told you, few men as I hated Royal Teague, and most of that hate was born right there at the woodpile, watching him stand in our yard and try to make my Della into a madwoman and a debtor in the same breath. The very woman he had robbed of her last dollar and her good name and damn near her life, try to make her into the liar so that he could ride off with whatever he'd come to get and her along with it. Because that was what he had come for. I understood it later, and my father understood it on the spot. Teague had not come to settle accounts. A man does not chase a penniless woman across a county to pay her. He had come because Della Mercer was the one robbed soul in his whole swindle who knew his face and his name and his trade, and could ruin him with it if she ever found a sheriff who'd listen. And a stranded madwoman in a county home, or a woman quietly removed, could ruin nobody. My father heard him all the way out. The rope again, all of it. And when Teague was done, my father said, very quiet, in the voice that in our family meant the fence post was going in, and the world was about to be a certain way. "You'll want to get back on that horse." Teague's smile flickered. "I don't think you take my meaning, friend. The law's an interest in this, a woman of unsound." "I take your meaning fine," my father said. "Your meaning's that you robbed her, and now you've come to bury what you robbed so it can't talk. And you rode up here figuring you'd find some lonesome fool you could smooth. You figured wrong. Get on the horse." And Della, who had come out onto the porch behind me somewhere in the middle of it, I do not know how much she heard, but I know it was enough, because I turned and saw her there, and her face was the face from the bridge, the gray, gone-past crying face, the look of a woman watching the one door she had left swing shut again. Della came down off the porch into the mud, and Teague saw her, and the two of them looked at each other across our yard, the robber and the robbed. And here is the thing I will tell you about Della Mercer, the thing that is the whole of her. She was afraid. I could see she was afraid. The man had taken everything from her once, and the fear of him was bone deep. But she walked down off that porch anyway and stood in her own fear in the open yard, and she did not let him make her the madwoman. She said, in a voice that shook and held, "His name is Royal Teague. He took $240 from me that was mine, and he took the same from Mrs. Aldous over in Conroy County, and from a widow in the Dakotas whose letters I saw in his office, and he is not a land agent. He runs a matrimonial swindle up and down this country and leaves women on the road behind him." She was looking dead at him. "I am not unsound." I am the one person in 3 territories who can put a name to your face under oath, and you know it. And that is the only reason in this world you have ridden all the way up this mountain after a woman you robbed of her last dollar. It was the bravest thing I ever saw a person do, and she did it in a mud yard in a borrowed dress with her own death 3 weeks behind her, and she did it standing on her own feet with no one's permission. And I want that on the record above everything else in this story, that, when the moment came, Della Mercer saved herself. My father stood ready and my father mattered, and I will tell you what he did. But she spoke first, and she spoke for herself, and the home she got at the end of this she walked to on her own 2 feet. Nobody carried her. Teague smooth went to something else then, something uglier, the way it does in such men when the smooth stops working. And my father took one step, putting himself square between Teague and Della. Not in front of her like she was helpless, but beside and before, the way you'd stand with anyone you'd thrown in with. And Tobias had come around the barn by then with the old 10-gauge broke over his arm, not pointed, just present, and held the way a man holds a tool he knows, and the arithmetic in the yard changed. Royal Teague stood in our mud yard and counted, the way his kind always counts. A rancher squared up in front of him, an old man with a broke 10-gauge over his arm, easy. A woman who had just named his whole swindle out loud in front of witnesses. A boy at the woodpile. He did the sum, and the sum did not come out his way, and a man like Teague does not fight a losing sum. He fights when the odds are a frightened woman alone on a road. Faced with a yard that would not break for him, the smooth came back over him like ice over a spring, and he laughed, light, and held up his hands. Misunderstanding, he said, clearly. A man can't talk business in this country without somebody fetching a gun. He backed toward his horse, still smiling, still talking because the talk was the only weapon he had left and he knew it. I'll trouble you no further, but I'd think on it, friend. A woman with a story like hers, a woman who climbs up on bridges you're building on sand. When it falls in on you, don't say you weren't. Get on the horse, my father said again, and this time there was a thing under his voice that even Teague heard, and Royal Teague got on the horse. He turned it at the gate. I will give him this, he had nerve to the last drop of it. He looked back across the yard at Della and he said, just for her, in a voice meant to crawl in under her skin and live there, I'll be down at Steeple Rock a few days yet. Accounts have a way of coming due. And he rode off down the muddy timber road, easy, like a neighbor, the way he'd come. It was not over. We all knew it was not over. A snake that rides off smiling is a snake that means to come back at night. And the thing that had come up our road was not the kind of thing my father could solve by standing in a yard. Because Teague was right about one thing. The cruel are always right about the one thing they use. And the one thing was this. The law and the town would take his word over Della's. He was a smooth man with a coat and a story. She was a stranded mail-order woman who had climbed up on a bridge. If it came to her word against his, in that county in that year, she would lose, and they both knew it, and that was the whole of his power. So my father did the thing that was harder than any standoff, and it is the part of this story I am proudest to tell, because it is the part where the hard man's hardness finally turned all the way over and became the other thing it had always secretly been. He went to town, not to fight Teague, to beat him at the only game that could be won, the truth, gathered and written and witnessed, until it was too heavy for one smooth man's word to lift. He was gone 4 days, and they were the longest 4 days, with Teague down the mountain and us up it, and I will not pretend we were not afraid. Tobias slept across the door with the 10-gauge. Della did not sleep much at all. I would wake and see her at the window, watching the road, the watcher Pearl used to be. But she did not break and she did not run, and when I frightened asked her once if she would have to go away, she took my face in her 2 hands the way Pearl took things, wholehearted, and she said, Caleb, listen to me. I am done running from that man. Whatever comes, I will meet it standing here. This is where I have decided to stand. And I believed her because she had already proved it in the yard, and a child believes the brave thing it has seen with its own eyes. What my father did down in Steeple Rock I had in pieces over the years. He did not go to the town first. He knew the town. He went past it. He rode 2 days over to Conroy County and found Mrs. Aldous, the widow Della had named, the one whose letters she'd seen. And Mrs. Aldous had been robbed by Teague the same as Della, $200 and her dead husband's watch, and had been too ashamed to say so to a living soul, the way the robbed so often are, carrying the swindler's shame as if it were their own. My father sat in her kitchen and told her there was another, up the mountain, who had near died of it and who had stood in a yard and named the man out loud, and something in that, in not being the only fool in the other woman's courage, straightened Mrs. Aldous's back. She wrote it down. She signed it. She gave my father the name of a third, over in the Dakotas, and the dates, and the false name Teague had used there. And my father carried that paper, 2 women's sworn word, with names and dates and sums, the beginning of the heavy thing, back to Steeple Rock, and he did not take it to the town. He took it past the town, too. He took it to the territorial marshal at the county seat, a man who did not care 2 cents what Steeple Rock thought of anybody, and who had, it turned out, already had 2 inquiries cross his desk about a matrimonial agent working the territories under a string of names, and who looked at my father's paper, and at the name Royal Teague, and got a particular still look on his face that lawmen get when a thing they have been reaching for finally comes into their hand. That was how it was done, not with the 10 gauge, with 2 robbed women's signatures and a rancher who rode 3 days to gather them, and a marshal who had been waiting for exactly that weight to drop. They took Royal Teague at the Steeple Rock Hotel, where he was indeed waiting a few days, waiting to see whether the lonesome rancher would crack. And he did not hang. This is not that kind of story. The frontier was rougher in the telling than in the truth, and most snakes end not on a rope, but in a territorial courtroom. He went to prison at the territorial seat for the swindling of women across 4 counties, and Della's word, the word of the stranded madwoman he'd counted on no one believing, was the center post the whole case stood on. The one thing he'd ridden up our mountain to bury was the very thing that buried him. When word of it came back up the timber road, and the shape of the thing got told and retold, Silas Reese rode 3 days to gather the proof, and the Mercer woman's word put Royal Teague behind bars and saved God knew how many women coming after. The town of Steeple Rock did the thing towns do, which is discover it had believed in her all along. The covered dishes started up the road again. The respectable women found they had always thought there was something fine about Miss Mercer. I was young enough to be bitter about it, and Della was wise enough not to be. Let them, she told me. A town that can be ashamed is a town that can be lived in. Don't begrudge people their second chance at being kind, Caleb. You may want one yourself someday. She was a school teacher to the bone. She could not help but teach, and that was the best lesson she ever gave me, and I have needed it more than once. They were married in May, when the aspens up on the knoll were in new leaf, up there, by my mother's grave, which was Della's asking, not my father's. I have always loved her for that. She did not want to begin her life in that house by pretending the first wife out of it. She wanted to be married in sight of Cora Reese's resting place, she said, so the children would see that the new love did not cancel the old one but stood on its shoulders, and so that she could, in her own private way, thank the woman whose children and whose husband she was taking up and promise her, I think, to do right by them. I was 11 by then, and I did not understand the half of it. I understand all of it now. I have buried a wife of my own and married again in my long life, and I know what it cost Della Mercer to stand at another woman's grave and pledge to love what that woman left behind, and I know it was the truest wedding I have ever stood at, and I have stood at many. The Reverend Pike married them, come back around, the way the town had and my father let him, which was its own forgiveness. Tobias gave Della away, stove up hip and all in his one good coat, and cried doing it and pretended it was the wind. The whole valley came up the mountain. The same road Della had walked down to die on in November, the whole county walked up it in May to see her wed, and if there is a better picture of how a life can turn, I have not found it. And Pearl got to say it at last, official in front of God and the county and the Aspens. When the Reverend asked who blessed this union, before anyone could answer the proper way, my sister, 6 now and sure of everything, piped up clear as a bell. I do. I picked her. And the whole crowd laughed, and Della laughed with the tears running, and my father, my hard, nailed-shut father, put his hand on Pearl's fair head and said, "So you did, girl. So you did." And that was the closest to the marriage vow, I think, that any of us truly meant. She got the bed by the window, by the way. Pearl. She'd asked for it that Bath night, "When you're our mama, can I have the bed by the window?" And she got it, and she slept under that window the rest of her childhood. And that is the kind of promise that gets kept in a real family, the small ones, the ones a child remembers. I am very old now. I have outlived all of them, which is the lot of the one who tells the story. My father lived a long life and a thawed one. The man who came in for noon meals never went back to hiding in his work, and the house that had eaten suppers in silence got loud, got full, got 2 more children in it that Della gave him, my half-brother and half-sister whom I loved as whole. He died in his own bed in his 80s with Della's hand in his, and his last clear words, Pearl told me for I was away, were about the weather and the stock, ordinary things, the small freight of a shared life, which was right, which was exactly right, because the small things were always where my father kept his love, and he handed her the small things to the very end. Della outlived him by 6 years and taught school in Steeple Rock, every one of them, the school they'd had none of since the fever, and there is a whole generation in that valley that got its letters off the woman the town once left on a bridge. She is buried up on the knoll with the Aspens, between Cora Reese and my father, which she asked for 2, the 3 of them together, no canceling, just love stood on the shoulders of love. I go up when I can still make the climb, which is not often now. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the old story, how it was that my father knew, that snowy day, to climb up the Black Spar after a woman he had never met, when a whole town had walked past her. I have thought about it 80 years, and here is the best I have. I do not think he climbed up there to save her. I think he climbed up there because he was a man with a nailed-shut door who recognized, across 60 feet of snow and iron, another soul standing at the same kind of edge he had been standing at, in his own way, for 2 years, and something in him that he had given up for dead went toward it before he could stop it. He did not save her out of his strength. He went to her out of his own wound. And she came down off that bridge and walked into our house, and healed the wound that had sent him out to her in the first place, and healed her own in the doing. And out of 2 broken people and an old man and 2 motherless children, there was made a family, whole, that no one in Steeple Rock would have bet a cold nickel on that November. That is the truth of how I got a mother. The whole town walked past the penniless woman on the high trestle. My grieving father climbed up, and my little sister, who had not yet learned to look away from anyone, looked straight at her and said, "Be our mama," and a ruined, dignified, courageous woman chose us back free on her own 2 feet, the way she did everything. I have tried all my life to deserve it. I do not know that I have, but I have set it down now, in the letters she taught me, so that it will not go into the ground with me, and so that whoever comes after will know that the hardest men can thaw, that the most ruined lives can turn in a single snowy afternoon, and that the bravest thing I ever saw was a penniless woman walking down off a porch into her own fear to name the truth in the open air.